On tonight, we ask that you would read, meditate, and pray about John chapter 18, verses 10 and 11. Again, that is John chapter 18, verses 10 and 11. The CDC has recently given the suggestion that people do not gather for the Thanksgiving holiday. Some are protesting, some are frustrated, some are bewildered as to what is the correct or incorrect thing to do. But let's not pretend that Thanksgiving or these gatherings are always enjoyable. You know how things can be with people arguing about anything and everything under the sun. I guess in some sense that's what family will do at times, and that's what makes family family. But sometimes our differences can lead to hostilities and uneasy feelings. Words can be said, things can be expressed that are not easily gotten beyond. When we think about differences, some of the greatest wars in history, and I say great not in terms of a positive spin, but in terms of the size or the magnitude of those wars, have been over idiotic things. At least they have been over things that reflect man's inability to reconcile differences and come together. Take, for example, the Korean War. What is interesting is this war began in 1950, and the war, it dealt with a lot of interesting issues. For example, the North had invaded the South, and that's what started the war. Both sides refused to accept their borders and their boundaries. Both sides had a different form of government, and they thought that the other should accept the legitimacy of their government as being universal and not just specific to one side or the other. North Korea was a socialist country supported by China and the Soviet Union. The South was supported by the United Nations, primarily the United States. In fact, 90% of the military personnel fighting with South Korea was the United States of America. Something interesting happened in October of 1950. The United Nations and their forces decided to invade the North, and they felt that this invasion, this military tactic, was going to end the war by Christmas. Well, if you know anything about history, the Korean War didn't end until 1953. And technically speaking, the war has really never ended. What surprised the United Nations was that China had entered the conflict and surprised their forces. There were some 3 to 5 million fatalities, mainly civilians. There were people who were tortured and starved as prisoners of war. Major cities were destroyed, and the conflict has never really been satisfactorily resolved. All of this because they had differences of opinions about government, because they had different allegiances to world governments, because they refused to accept boundaries, and because they demanded legitimacy for their own form of government. This sounds so much like people, even in our families, in our churches, even in this country. We're divided over opinions. We're divided over politics, personalities. We're divided over so many trivial things. But one of the things we must learn, as we see in John chapter 18, and as we see with the Korean War, going to war does not stop war. Again, in China, they determined to surprise the UN forces. who thought that they could end the war by attacking others. Peter must have thought this same thing. For in John chapter 18 and verse number 10, we read, Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, and smote the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Then said Jesus unto Peter, Put up thy sword into the sheath. The cup which my Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? You see, this is during the arrest of Jesus and his eventual experience at Calvary. Peter thought that he could be big, bad, and bold by pulling out his sword and stopping war. Fire does not need to be met with fire. Fire needs to be met with love. This sounds idealistic, but there's never been a war that has been stopped because of war, and hatred has never been undone or converted by hatred. At this time of year where you are engaging family members, whether it is in person or via Zoom or just on a telephone call, this is not a time to fight over politics and whose political side is going to do the best for the country. This is a time for us and our families, no matter what our issues have been, to exercise love, to learn how to really respect one another even when we disagree. We have to learn how to forgive. It seems so hard to forgive others until we recognize how much God has forgiven us for. We need healing in our country. We need healing in our government. But we need so much more healing in our families. Families have had disputes about so many things. Who got more land when Big Mama died? Who got more inheritance, or who was denied an inheritance? Those things that are trivial in nature when compared to our eternal destiny. We must use this time to value time together. One of the things that we should have learned from this COVID experience is that not only is tomorrow not promised, tonight is not promised. So let us learn to value the precious time that we have. Let's value our loved ones. Again, a bold lesson from COVID is that somebody can be here, and before we know it, they're taken from this life. And certainly, we want to have memories, but we can't have precious memories without precious moments. Reach a point in your thinking where you see every moment as precious and valuable, and create lasting memories by making each moment count. And when there are differences in the family, when there are differences around you, don't fan the flame. Don't pull out your piece trying to make peace. Don't be like Peter, thinking that you're going to solve a sin problem with more sin, a hate problem with more hatred. It didn't work for Peter. It didn't work with the UN when they tried to stop a war by going to war. The war continued. What we must learn from this lesson, and what we need to learn in life, is that God's character, God's way, and God's will must supersede our human strategies so that we can get a godly outcome. Enjoy this time that you will have for the Thanksgiving holiday. But when differences arise with those you love, and they're surely to do that, don't fight fire with fire. Don't pull out your sword. Be determined to be the loving person. Love makes a difference.